What's up, and welcome back to Real Ballers Read. We are super excited for another episode today. But first of all, we would love to just give a shout out to all of our listeners so far, everyone who's been with us along this journey. Feels like it's been a long road already, but we're just getting warmed up. And we would love to just love on you, our listeners, anyone who's been following us from the beginning, who just started listening to us last episode, even to say that we appreciate your time and attention. It really means a lot. And if you feel compelled, please leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening to us from, because we'd love to get your feedback. You can also reach out to us on Instagram. But yeah, I mean, we can just get into it for today.
Definitely,
Yeah,
definitely. And we wanted to give a shout out to the Blacks with Books podcast. They were the first podcast that we've
that's
ever been
right.
guest on.
That's right.
It was super fun to talk with them, to Brittany and Kashera. They were really just incredible hosts and really warm. So glad we got to share the space with them. And I think we really, all four of us really were spin bars. So
Yeah,
you
it's,
got to
yeah,
check it out.
yeah. They were a dynamic duo for sure, and it
Yeah.
was great to have a little four-way conversation there. And it was a real blessing too, because we got to tell our story. We got to talk about Real Ballers Read and everything that it means to us, and especially because we were recording on October 25th, which was Bell Hooks' birthday. We got to talk about her a lot as well and the influence that she's had on our lives.
Yeah. And so that's exactly why for this episode, we wanted to talk about a Bell Hooks book. Almost 50 episodes into our own podcast, and we were shocked that we hadn't talked about one yet or that a guest hadn't brought it up. So we had to do it justice by bringing in We Real Cool. I think this was the first, this was the first Bell Hooks book that both of us read, or was that all about love?
I think it might have been all about
Yeah, it
love.
was.
Yeah,
Which you read first.
yeah, I did. I
Yeah.
did. Because I read it my sophomore year,
Mhm.
and then just was blown away by it. I think, you might have already known of it at that point, but
Mhm.
I definitely was like, oh, you got to read it. But then you found We Real Cool and put me onto it, right?
Yeah, I was actually put on to the book by my pro fight, Aaron. So shout out to AG, great guy.
Mm,
And I think we were just talking about what masculinity meant to us at the time. We were having some debates at our school. And so he reached out to us and gave the book to us, the PDF form, to read it. And then I had checked it out from the library and read it. And I was just blown away completely by the breadth of the book and the depth, the extent to which she explains everything in the bell hooks fashion too was just incredible. So
yeah,
we were skimming through the book again before this
yeah,
podcast and just so in awe of everything that she shares in it. So we can't wait to crack into it now.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny that you even mentioned, the conversations around masculinity at Stanford. I know that there was like basically some huge blow up thing that was happening almost every year that I was at Georgetown, in the Black community, probably almost always centered around, Black men on campus and just how they were acting. It led to a lot of controversy and a lot of heartbreak, unfortunately. But I think even you just mentioning that now really reminded me just how much of the context mattered for when we started to read Bell Hooks in college. I mean, she is a college
Yeah.
professor, but she's somebody who, as Miles was saying, is an absolute expert when it comes to like bringing all of the depth and the critical lens and the academic analysis into like relational problems and like personal problems for people. I definitely, for one, would have loved to take a class with her in person.
That would be crazy.
Um,
I know.
because that would have been chilly. It might have been too much, honestly, because even reading We Real Cool, reading all the books that I've read of hers, each one just like really speaks to me in a way that's like affirming and validating, but also so challenging. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
Bell Hooks writes with so much care and concern in her books. And I think that really came through with
Mhm.
Read Real Cool,
Mhm.
because, she's saying, hey, like, I'm not a Black man, but I
Mhm.
have a lot of black men in my life that I care about, that I'm concerned about, and I'm gonna write this book because nobody's doing this justice. You know what I'm
Yep,
saying?
yep.
Yeah.
And so the book itself, though, is named after the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, "We Real Cool." So, Jen, don't you have that like down,
Oh
like
yeah, 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 for sure.
memorized fully?
Right. So,
Yeah.
all right, check this. We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon.
Damn, that's deep.
Yeah,
Gwendolyn Brooks, native Chicagoan too.
that's right. Gwendolyn Brooks Middle School, right down the street from us in Oak Park here.
Wait, what?
Yeah,
That's crazy.
yeah, you didn't know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, bro, that's where
Wow.
Simone went to school.
Wow. But
Gwendolyn Brooks Middle School.
um
There's a whole mural of her and everything, man, with "We Real Cool" on the wall. That's how I remembered
of
it.
the school,
Yeah, of the school.
why would they encourage
I
that?
don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, it's definitely one of her more famous poems,
Mhm.
and it does have that piece there too. We left school, right? So that was kind of interesting
Yeah,
to see as well.
yeah.
But no, yeah, it's a beautiful mural of her, and also a shout out to other Black women leaders who are kind of like within her legacy. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a great shout out to Gwendolyn Brooks, and of course, also the title of Bell Hooks's book, definitely taking in that legacy too.
Exactly. So at the start of the book, like what is Bell Hooks spelling out as the main problem facing Black men?
Right. So she addresses a recent book in her time because when did We Real Cool come out in
At the turn of
2004?
the century,
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
exactly. And Bell Hooks is like, hey, nobody loves black men, including black men. Black men
Mhm,
especially don't love themselves. And
mhm,
here's why. I'm gonna lay out all of the dynamics around history and sexuality and
mhm.
violence and rap culture and school, anger, rage, parenting, capitalism, right? She literally went through in each chapter like a different facet of like black male existence today or in
Right.
2004 to really uncover and critique all of the ways in which the world is set up against black men in a lot of ways, and it
Mhm.
starts when we're kids by how we're raised, and then the older that we get, it really only gets worse in the ways that black men try to survive in their own world, but have all of these negative outcomes for themselves and the people closest to them.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so the envy of the world as a book title too is a literary reference as well to a passage in Sula by Toni Morrison, in which a black woman says to a black man that he's loved by everyone. And I'm not going to read that whole quote now, but then Bell Hooks responds in the preface is that sadly, the real truth, which is a taboo to speak, is that this is a culture that does not love black males, that they are not loved by white men, white women, black woman, or girls and boys, and that especially most black men do not love themselves. How could they? How could they be expected to love surrounded by so much envy, desire, and hate? Black males in the culture of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy are feared, but they are not loved. Of course, part of the brainwashing that takes place in a culture of domination is the confusion of the two. And yeah, I mean, thinking of all that's even happened in this year with such public figures as Will Smith and
Yay.
recently Draymond Green and Jordan
Draymond.
Poole
Yeah.
with their violence against each other, I think this is especially a great book to crack open now. And yeah, yeah, just need to
Yeah.
analyze all
Absolutely.
parts.
Absolutely, for sure. There's definitely too much in this book to cover in like a single episode. I
Mhm.
mean, we have had this book with us for the last 2, 3 years,
Right.
basically, and we're still learning and feeling challenged by it. Um, but I think what I really appreciate about Bell Hooks and why it's so resonating is that she really does say there's so much at stake here, right? The souls our individual souls, our souls as a collective of Black
Mhm,
men, of Black people generally,
mhm.
is totally at stake by the ways in which we like treat ourselves, right? The way that we
Right,
regard ourselves. And she gets into so many of the problems, but also offers like a lot of different solutions too, which I think
definitely.
makes it like a really challenging book as well, in the sense that she really does say, like, hey, like, yeah, it's tough. Yeah, there's a lot going on, but there's definitely something that you can be responsible for here too
Mhm,
for making it better.
mhm.
Um,
So, as a Black man, like, reading We Real Cool for the first time, what spoke to you most?
yeah, I guess just the strength of Bell Hooks's voice alone stood out to me, right?
Mhm,
I mean, that's kind of what we've been talking about. I would say that the first thing that really struck me, other than just the setting that she laid out in the introduction, was for sure her chapter on schooling Black boys
mm,
a few years ago, right? We were at the end of our college experience.
mhm,
I think, especially being in the pandemic, being at home and learning virtually, I, for one, was definitely thinking about the arc of my education
mhm,
in a way that I hadn't before. I was thinking
mhm,
about all of the illusions and parts that I was really disappointed by, that I was angry about.
mhm,
And reading We Real Cool at that time and seeing her section on how schooling really does mess up a lot of Black boys and like challenge them in ways that is just really hard to overcome, I think was the first part that really shocked me into being like, oh man, like I really got to pay attention here. It also definitely is the first step that she takes towards helping every reader really think more critically about their own childhoods,
mm,
which is, another one of the solutions that she proposes as ways to really kind of heal as Black men, which is about really understanding like our childhood experiences.
mm,
She talked about Richard Wright as one example of a Black boy who had a lot of questions, was clearly smart, and was just never really validated and affirmed for his intellectual life in school.
yeah,
And especially when so much of representation in school is white folks, and in particular white men who are the ones writing the books and teaching the books and deciding everything about like how you live your life when you're at school. I mean, it really does create kind of an environment where when you can look to athletes and musicians and these larger than life famous Black men, and they're using their physical bodies. And she kind of says that school, with how messed up it is, really does kind of train Black men into believing, or Black boys into believing, that their full purpose is in like physical labor, right? It's only in their
mm,
bodies. It has nothing to do with their minds. And I think, especially because we were at that point as well of just starting up with Real Ballers Read and coming to be more confident in ourselves as readers, reading that chapter on schooling and how bad it is for Black boys in particular, I think really spoke to me as just showing how important it was that we were reading, that we do value our intellectual lives, and for sure gratitude to our parents for instilling that in us. But it did really increase the urgency as well for making that more of a widespread appreciation
mhm,
and encouragement and affirmation to all Black children and Black boys, in the case of reading We Real Cool, that our intellectual lives, our spiritual lives, our emotional lives do matter.
mm. That's profound.
Yeah, there you go.
I think the biggest part that stuck out to me when I first read it was just how she articulated that patriarchy was kind of created by white people and that sexually, vocationally, and financially, just how we think about power and domination, like we cannot accept these white definitions as Black men because they were meant to make us feel disempowered and disenfranchised. And she does that in a lot of different ways, but I think her early on in the book, she makes that argument. I don't know what the anthropologists or, historians exact record is of this, and I know that there's a lot of debate around how patriarchal or matriarchal even something like African society was pre-colonization, but I still think that this idea alone of there is a hegemonic view of patriarchy and making sure that you're at least aware of what that definition entails is a big step in making sure that you are not addicted to sex or to substances or the oppressed or rageful or violent and kind of some of the things that men in modern society have a lot of problems with.
Right.
So
Yeah. And that, I mean, that's really deep too, because it's like kind of what she's talking about is that there are, at least in terms of our cultural conversations, there's very little common ground around how everything that you were just describing hurts Black men. But the numbers are definitely there with just how endemic domestic abuse is, like alcoholic abuse, drug abuse, emotional well-being of Black families, just the general dysfunction of Black families in a lot of cases. So the it's not like the numbers aren't there, the facts aren't there. Like she's very much giving a lot of evidence as well as the narratives, to show the consequences of what happens when we do buy into these systems that really weren't made for us and aren't designed to benefit us at all.
at all.
Yeah.
And hmm,
I was actually looking for a quote of what you were describing because I had an idea of where it was, and it's in her first chapter on plantation patriarchy. The quote is that the image of Black masculinity that emerges from slave narratives is one of hardworking men who long to assume full patriarchal responsibility for families and kin. This testimony shows that enslaved Black males were socialized by white folks to believe that they should endeavor to become patriarchs by seeking to attain the freedom to provide and protect for Black women to be benevolent patriarchs. Benevolent patriarchs exercised their power without using force, and it was this notion of patriarchy that educated Black men coming from slavery into freedom sought to mimic. However, a large majority of Black men took as their standard the dominator model set by white masters. When slavery ended, these Black men often used violence to dominate Black women, which was a repetition of the strategies of control white slave masters used.
uh,
Yeah. So like, I mean, she's clearly talking about slavery, right? Which
yeah,
ended in the 1860s. But how is it that everything that was going on then is like still happening now, right? Like, how is this book still relevant? How is that point still relevant?
yeah. You know, it's wild. The first example that I thought of, which is particularly difficult, is about the NFL.
Mm,
Many people think the NFL resembles modern day sharecropping or slavery, even though they're paid a lot of money, like a lot of money. But these rich white owners get to exploit their labor of Black men for most of their adult lives or their peak
mhm.
physicality of their
Put them
adult
at a
lives,
lot of risk.
put them at a lot of risk. And, they develop from the repeated head trauma, this condition called CTE, which ends up with you kind of physically abusing many of your loved ones, possibly. Folks talk about how NFL players deal with this domestic abuse. And I think that that's interesting given that same metaphor.
Mm,
And just in so many examples in pop culture in
mm.
general, though, there are Black men that abuse or beat women, and it's still debated very heavily, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. But you did remind me too about a article that I read a couple years back about how basically neuroscientists provided evidence for why absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? That kind of truthism
Wow.
that we all talk about. And they were like, hey, nah, like we looked at the brain scans or the brains of people who were in very high positions of power,
Mm,
and they looked like they went through a lot of concussions, right? And I think that's one thing that we forget or don't even realize yet and don't really talk about definitely is how traumatic power is and how traumatic patriarchy is, how traumatic whiteness is, which is
mhm,
something that Wendell Berry talks about a lot in The Hidden Wound. And he's a peer, so to speak, of Bell Hooks, right? Both being from Kentucky and being thought partners in a sense.
mhm,
Um, but, right, I think that's something that really gets back to not only the ways in which Black men, once they're quote unquote adults and are working and have to make a living for themselves, are very much traumatized through that process of capitalism and being exploited. But it does start young too, right? And it's something where even being raised in patriarchy is very much traumatic. Bell Hooks really gets into it, into this point actually in her chapter about anger. It's
mm,
called From Angry Boys to Angry Men, and the idea is that when you're a boy, right, you're being socialized to become a man. And being a man means being able to have and exercise control and power over other people, right? And I think where it starts when you're a boy is that it's like, hey, like if you want to get to that point of having power over others and your environment, it starts with having power over yourself. And the main way that you have power over yourself is by controlling your emotions, right? And if you're rewarded, if you are given attention by and supported by controlling your emotions, for coming off cool and calm and collected all the time, right? That kind of makes you look like you're more mature and masculine in a sense. And the boys who are able to do that are rewarded. And of course, when you're just trying to grow up and survive, I mean, it does direct a lot of Black boys, especially with the images that were provided of in movies and sports and music, of really just, you know, being emotionless, right?
mm.
And I think that's a big part of patriarchy too, is just kind of disregarding emotions as irrational and stupid,
Yeah,
that prioritization of rationality.
yeah,
And
definitely.
especially when you're a sensitive young child, you have a lot of emotions, and the world is telling you to bottle them all up and contain them, right? And not express them, and that's how you succeed in the world. That's a really tough place to put a child, right?
Wow.
Of any gender, sexuality, race, whatever. But I think Bell Hooks really does a good job of describing how that's particularly the case with Black boys, which again, a lot of times does come down to school, right? Because if you are in school and you're acting up, right? Acting up, so to speak, in the perspective of the teacher, you're going to get in trouble for it.
Mhm,
There are definitely clear statistics around how much more frequently Black children, boys and girls, are expelled from pre-K onwards
mhm,
for quote unquote like acting up when they're just being their normal selves, right?
right.
But it really did bring me to this quote as well from this chapter, another Bell Hooks quote, that if a Black boy obeys authority, is quiet, and does his homework, he tends to be viewed as psychologically whole simply because he is not a problem, as in not a problem for the adults in his life. Repressed emotions in Black boys tend to be viewed not as a problem, but as a boon to society, since the quiet, obedient Black boy will know his place, excuse me, and stay in it. Bell Hooks describes this as soul murder, right? And she thinks, hey, like if you soul murder a child and they are now hurt, then what are they going to do? Go on and hurt other people.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I'm trying to think. I didn't get a chance to reread this chapter fully, but does she get into how anger can be used positively? I remember her talking about how anger was kind of a cover for depression and repression, but I'm thinking of someone like Audrey Lorde now, who says you can use your anger and help it bring you to action about stuff. And I'm thinking of someone like a Malcolm X too, who is anger articulated to the point of like a boiling rage that was able to clarify and shape the minds of a lot of Black people across the world, right?
Yeah.
So maybe if she doesn't bring it up there, I have to go back in and
Yeah.
see
No,
disagree
hey,
that it
that's
can
a
be useful.
no,
Yeah.
that is a really good point. I think there is a definitely a fire, a clarity, an energy to anger.
Mhm.
Um, and I think for most of the chapter, she is kind of conceptualizing it as a problem in the ways in which anger turns to violence against yourself and others.
Mhm.
But she says that at the end of the day, how we get out of this situation is, and how we actually respond and use anger as a potential positive is through, uh, really just stopping denying all of our emotions, right? Whether it's anger or sadness or shame, guilt, joy, even, right? Just Bell Hooks is making the point that when you are better able to name and claim your emotions, then when you name and claim anger, it can be used towards more like productive pro-social ends,
Mhm.
but it's within the context of generally being able to recognize that you do have feelings and that's okay, right? So I think that's kind of where she goes with it. She doesn't give great examples like you mentioned of Lord and X that show how anger can move the world and move somebody to do great things.
Mhm.
But she does recognize as well that a lot of this is just about recognizing that it's okay to feel anything, right? Especially anger.
Wow. Very true.
Yeah.
Very true. And I think a good segue from anger, though, is actually the chapter prior about sex, because I think, especially in today's world, I don't even know how long we can say it has been today's world, because even though certain parts of our environment have changed, I think the underlying culture has stayed the same for a
Yeah.
long, long time. And that's kind of
Yeah.
what she's arguing here, where sex is put on a pedestal. And I think today, when we have the internet, that comes with even more frequency of that kind of content, pornography, and music videos. I don't even know. You know what I'm saying? Is pervasive in like a young boy's mind from the minute that he's born to being a young man in the internet age. It's hard not to think that sex is not a big part of your life as a man, as a
Yeah.
real man,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, this was a big thing that I learned from the first time reading this book. That was very important, was just like, sex does not make me a man. And disconnecting that and knowing that my worthiness as a person is not built on that physical validation from someone else, I think is a really important step to take out of that mindset that sex is everything.
Mm.
And I think a great quote too from that chapter about sex is, directly and indirectly, we are handed sexuality as the one vehicle through which it might be possible to express and experience the essential aspect of our humaneness that has been slowly and systemically conditioned out of us. That is why men are so obsessed with sex. We are born sensual creatures with an unlimited capacity to feel and an effortless propensity to deeply connect with all human beings. We are then subjected to continuous conditioning to repress sensuality, numb feelings, ignore our bodies, and separate from our natural closeness with our fellow human beings. All of these human needs are then promised to us by way of sex and sexuality. That's a really important quote to me, because just as she's saying, men a lot of the times feel like their only means of intimacy or feeling that close to someone is through sex physically. It's our way to feel seen, but also it's kind of our way to just express like domination. And this is where locker room talk comes in,
Oh
when,
yeah.
young boys are meant to brag and boast about their encounters and even make them up as a way to show that they're men.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I mean, that was really another part that just gave me chills the first time I read it. I mean,
Yeah.
I was at home with you during the pandemic, right? And I was already in my relationship with Simone at that point, but I was also like a year out of a whole phase in college. And like reading that chapter, It's a Dick Thing,
Yeah.
was just like, that was crazy, honestly, because even though I did what I did and absolutely hated it, didn't really enjoy it, I did think that my sexuality was tied to my sense of confidence, to my sense of masculinity, to my sense of who I was, who I thought I was.
Mhm.
And that I think that was maybe one of the craziest parts of the book is just really going and thinking that you're alone in something, that you're the only case of it. And then you realize that Bella Hooks wrote a book that was like completely studying your life in 2004, right?
Yeah.
I think that's ridiculous. But your quote reminded me that I think, and this is, for all people, but particularly for how boys are raised, I think there is definitely an idea here that you are meant to be alone and you're always going to be alone. You're supposed to be alone. And that's kind of what it means to cut off your emotions and really not be able to communicate your emotions and therefore not connect with anybody. And it goes for what you were saying just now from that quote about sex too, where it's like if you cut yourself off from everything and then just see sex as that one outlet, it's inherently unhealthy, right? It's bound to be unhealthy, not just for you, but for everyone else. And I think that was definitely a huge piece of my own experience in college that I remember is
Mhm.
just feeling like I was alone, right? And I was completely isolated. And that's what it meant for me to be able to keep emotionally stiff arming people,
Mhm.
trying to keep distance. And right. I mean, it's a really scary thing, I think, actually, even just reflecting on it now and how much I still have to get over that idea of feeling alone, right? Because yeah, it's just tough. It's just tough, but that's what's crazy is that there's so many people that feel alone, and we're all navigating very similar things. We're all dealing with similar challenges, and yet we're not always able to talk about it, which is why I think Bell Hooks is so courageous for even writing this book.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Of all of the issues that Bell Hooks talks about in the book, which would you say is the most causal to the others?
Interesting.
Or like, what is the right word for that? Not original, but
Like the instigator. Which one is
yeah,
like which one is
the real
causing
culprit.
the rest? Yeah.
Yeah,
Which one is at the root of
yeah.
things?
Because I think Bell Hooks would argue that it's low self-esteem.
Huh.
Many psychologists have argued as well, though, that self-esteem is not even a real thing. So, I mean, it is a made-up term. It's not. It doesn't really point to a physical thing in the body, but I think it's more just self-image and a healthy ego.
Mhm. Mhm.
Ellis Coase, which Bell Hooks argued against, thought that the source of many of these issues was abandonment.
Mm. Mm. That's a really good question. I mean, right. Each of the chapters that we've been talking about is definitely more of the outcomes, the external manifestations of things like abandonment and self-esteem issues.
Mhm.
There's definitely something here internal which we all navigate, but in particular, something that she says is that when your emotional needs aren't met, you learn that your needs don't matter. Your emotional needs don't matter. And then
Wow.
once you believe that your emotional needs don't matter, it's very easy to start believing that you don't matter at all, right? Or your mind, your emotions, your feelings, your stories and experience don't matter, right? Maybe your physical body still matters because that's what's affirmed by other people, but right, all of that other stuff doesn't really count for much. And I think at the core of that is really a question of whether or not we believe we are worthy of love.
Mm.
And
Wow.
That goes for self-love and love from other people, right? Where if we have internalized shame and guilt and anger and grief as well, just grief at the lost and wounded and hurt child that we used to be. Think there's just a lot of raw emotions there, which make us feel like we're not worthy of love, like we're broken somehow and don't deserve it. And I think that's a really sad thing. That's definitely more of an internal dynamic, I would say, too, in the last 2 years from reading this book. I definitely am going to reread it soon, especially now that we're talking about it. But I would say that another huge challenge, and this is more of a external condition, is just the fact that we do have to make money in order to survive and meet our basic needs, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like now that we are older and capable of making money, what are we going to do? Help meet those emotional needs that we didn't necessarily have met when we were growing up,
Yeah.
right? And of course, that leads to all other kinds of issues in terms of our ability to be financially responsible and take care of ourselves. But really and truly, the deck is kind of stacked against you when you're just the individual trying to make a living for yourself. Because, right, I mean, Bell Hooks talks about how much masculinity, in the same way that you were talking about our masculinity being tied to our sexuality, she also was the first person to show me that masculinity is also tied with your earning potential and how much money you're able to make. And that's particularly tough for Black men because we are really at the extremes of making money and also being the poor, like making a lot of money and then also
Mhm.
being the poorest.
Mhm.
Right. And so then when you come out of college or when you come out into the working world and you're responsible for yourself
Mhm.
and you got to make money, it's like, that's how you put food on the table. That's how you're able to support yourself. That's how you're able to be responsible for other people. And it really sucks. And it comes with a lot of costs, which she talks about. But it definitely is a challenge in that sense of being the cause of all the other things. Because if you do have to sacrifice so much of yourself to potentially even survive, I mean, that is kind of what reinforces it in terms of how you parent, how you don't have as much time to care for yourself, care for your community. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Yeah. What do you
Mhm.
think though?
No, that was a beautiful answer. And yeah, I think it was a trick question, though. There is no one cause. Everything is happening all at once,
That is true. That is true.
especially growing up. Culture isn't just one thing, it is all the things that she talks about.
Mhm.
However, I think when we take action and try to become more aware of our own difficulties or problems as Black men, I think the starting point for a lot of young men now is their relationship to women. And that kind of, I think, is the main focal point for why young men have wanted to self improve is they are nervous to talk around a girl. So then they go get confident. That was
That
honestly
was for you, bro. That was
how
definitely
I started learning how to flirt and all that stuff. Right. Or they want to look in better shape to attract the opposite gender, and they start caring a lot about fitness now. So it seems like sex, even for women too, and thinking just about beauty standards too,
Oh
is
yeah.
what
Yeah.
makes the world go round in a sense. And when you think about our evolutionary purpose,
Mhm.
I think that would make sense, even though I don't think it's the source of all of the problems.
I see. I see
Yeah,
what you're saying.
yeah.
That survival instinct,
Right, right. Yeah, Jane and I actually were watching this documentary series the last week called The Century of the Self. We won't get too into it here, but I think Bell Hooks would have a lot of great things to say about it. But it centers around this guy named Edward Bernays, and
Yeah.
his uncle is Sigmund Freud, and he was one of the main guys who created marketing in public relations and made products that we didn't need, but we wanted. And there's a part of the docu-series where they talk about this psychologist named Wilhelm Reich, who argues
Here we
that
go.
uh, all problems and all neuroses came from a lack of orgasm. So he would say that sex is the cause
Yeah.
for everything that we're talking about.
Ah,
That's
yeah,
why I
yeah,
wanted to introduce that. But
right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. A wild story,
Mhm,
wild documentary. Seriously, that's the Century of the Self. By the way, it's a
mhm,
BBC documentary. The whole thing is on YouTube.
mhm.
We watched the first episode and like couldn't stop.
Yeah,
It was
it's
crazy.
really good. How does We Real Cool though affect you now? How does it make you want to be a better man now?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think one part of that, one tweak is about how does this book just want to make me a better person, right? Um, Obviously, I do identify as a man, but I think part of what she's talking about as well is just recognizing how complex we really are as individuals
Mhm,
and seeing the ways in which we can express ourselves and also acknowledge all the parts of our identity. And yeah, I would say that for one thing, reading bell hooks over the years has completely changed my life and has definitely improved my emotional intelligence, right? My ability to name and claim my emotions, as I was saying. That's something that's I'm definitely still a work in progress in, is being able to even recognize when I'm feeling something. I mean, from the minute that I started dating Simone, she'd always be like, "Oh, what's wrong?" And it used to frustrate me
mhm.
because I didn't even know what was wrong. I didn't even know that I was like giving off wrong vibes, right? But
Right.
she knew because she was sensitive to it, and she'd be asking me, putting me on the spot, whatever. But of course, she was really just trying to check in, and I didn't even know what to tell her, right? So I'd say, "Oh, like nothing, I'm fine." I just kind of shirk it off. But then 20 minutes later, I'd be like, "Wait a second, is something wrong?" I feel like maybe something was bothering me, and I just wasn't even aware of it, right? So even having that kind of emotional literacy, this gets to what you're saying about our relationships with women too. And I mean, it does go for anybody that we're interacting with, right? Just generally being able to be more honest, communicate emotions, tell stories as well is
Mhm,
something that I think that I'm working on, right? Telling like personal stories about how something made me feel or how I interpreted something.
mhm.
So I think there's definitely an element of we real cool, which right, in terms of making me a better man, right? There's a school of life episode on YouTube about the image of the cool guy, right?
Mhm.
And they propose at the end that we should actually work on being warm, right? And I think bell hooks would agree with that idea of being warm in the ways in which we uh are able to express that we are emotional, that we are sensitive, and yet in a way that's nurturing and a light and inspiring for other people. I think you're great at being a warm presence
Mhm,
with the people that you're around,
mhm,
and that's something that I definitely still think about with this book
mhm.
and want to work on is just my warmth, my presence.
Yeah.
I think that there are things like talking with other people in general, and especially other Black men about this book, about these topics, and just how we do go through a lot of similar challenges, but don't really talk about them all the time. That's definitely something that I think inspires me to become a better man, just her own courage and talking about all these things, especially when people weren't always trying to listen to her or were trying to shut her down. And she just kept standing in her truth.
Yeah.
And was definitely a feeling that I got from reading the book. I was like, man, like she's really saying a lot of truth here.
Mhm,
And it's my responsibility. It's our responsibility as readers to honor that, right? And to
mhm,
share it with other people and stand in our own truth.
mhm.
So yeah, I think that kind of answers your question.
It does. It
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it just clarifies that I need to still spend the time to think about what it means to be me and not what it means to be like a good man. Because I think when people get into the debates about what a man is or what a man is not. They they're really just trying to express their own self-image, right? And to project it onto others. But in
They fill in all
actuality,
the descriptions
yeah,
that fit them. Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
do think a lot of men share fundamental needs, and especially in family roles, do have fundamental responsibilities in terms of providing and making sure the family is protected.
Mhm.
Yet, I don't think that those fundamental responsibilities or needs need to get in the way of right a father or a man being also emotional and loving too. So it's about for me knowing who I am and yeah, just being aware of both what the society I feel expects of me and how I can best serve and fulfill my own purpose and shine as a light, for others. So
Mhm.
there's this book, reading it again though, brings so many ideas and so much clarity to my own life. I'm just so grateful for it and for her work in general, for being so clear and accessible and
Absolutely.
just so
Absolutely.
many adjectives that we could use. And yeah, it was really hard. Honestly, the day she passed last December.
15th.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jen, my sister Vera, and I, we all just had like a group FaceTime call, and we were so shocked. And we still felt she was really young, and we would always talk about. I'm talking like the years prior to her passing. We were just like, we need to go down to Kentucky and say what up
Yeah, I
to her,
know.
and
We were trying
always
to
were
pull up on her, yo.
thinking about how we were gonna email her or get in touch with her. And even though that can't happen in the physical world now, I think we still feel very close to her through her work and through her books, and her
Wow.
legacy is there forever. So
Yeah. No, that's really super deep. I mean, we I definitely have a lot of like progress to make, work to do
mhm.
emotionally, just even rereading the book and re-examining myself and listening to everything that Bell Hooks is saying is really like a lifelong endeavor, right? And it's a communal endeavor in the sense that, right, it kind of depends on everybody participating in some way because we already are, and we can change in small and big ways, which over time can just really improve the collective well-being of Black folks, right? That's all she cared about. But I mean, it's incredible how even within 2 years of reading this book, we could have another entire episode just off of all the ways that reading this book and really paying attention to it and thinking through it has already changed our interactions and our feelings and the books that we've read and the people that we've come across, the experiences that we've had in our lives, the things that we do. I mean, it really does show how, right, you really connect with bell hooks in this book, We Real Cool, and it'll ripple through like all the people that know you and all the people that know who you know what I'm saying? It's crazy, just
It is
the
crazy.
impact that that has. And it's also crazy to think that as much impact and influence as it's been, like we're only now just talking about this book, right?
Which is crazy.
And obviously everything in its time, it did take a minute to kind of process it and
Mhm.
get that
Definitely.
experience under our belt, but I'm really glad that we got to talk about it today and
Yeah.
dissect it, share some quotes.
Yeah. No, we definitely got to crack into all of her books on the
Absolutely.
podcast. I
Yeah.
mean, they're all so accessible for our audience too. So we want you all to dive into these, any of our Black men listeners of the podcast. Definitely check out this book. And if you're a Black woman too,
Hey,
obviously.
if you're
Yeah.
anybody that cares about Black men,
Yeah.
like, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Or you care about
Yeah.
yourself and how you relate to Black, right? Like it's so expansive, right? And
Really is.
yeah,
Really is.
right.
But thank you so much for listening to this episode, joining us on this journey.
That we were keeping it
47.
real with Reggie Bailey. Now we were keeping it
Craziness.
real with Bell Hooks. That's
Crazy.
all she talked about.
Crazy.
Real ballers read. We real cool. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.